So when I was just starting off as a finishing carpenter, my all-time favorite uncle, good old Uncle Sid, gave me the contract to do the finishing work on an entire apartment building by myself. And some 700 doors later, I had taken the door hanging method that I learned from my dad, tweaked it, honed it, and pretty much perfected it. So I'm super excited to show you the method, and stick around at the very end. There's an absolutely critical step that you don't want to mess up when it comes to cutting off the door shims. So step number one, you have to analyze your rough opening before you start trying to jam this thing in and it doesn't fit. So measure the door at the header. See how wide it is, the frame. Measure the height, and then check out your rough opening. Ideally, you would want to have a 1/2 of an inch of space so that you can get the door sitting perfectly plumb. On the height, ideally, you would want to have a 1-inch space. That way, you're going to have some room to lift the door up to accommodate flooring. Next thing you want to check is grab your level. A 6-foot level is ideal for door framing, but a 4-foot level will work as well. So grab the level and then check the plumb of both of the sides, kind of in both directions. And if your framing is nice and plumb, you can definitely afford to have slightly tighter tolerances on the gap. If it's out of plumb quite a bit, you're going to want to be really careful and possibly adjust the framing before you start installing the door. To adjust the framing, sledgehammer, sawzall, maybe you want to pound the bottom over and cut off that plate. Throw some shims in here and pound this over just to get yourself that extra space so that you can get everything sitting perfectly plumb. And then the last thing you want to check before you get installing the door is how level is it across the floor. A 2-foot level will be ideal here. Even better than that is a nice little laser level. Throw that on, see what you have across the floor. And now there's a couple different scenarios that I'll run you through here. If you're working in a situation where there isn't any flooring and it's coming in afterwards, you want to shim the door up with some little shims, the thickness of the flooring. The key here to remember, you do not want to shim it up past the thickness of the flooring. So if you're off level, shim it the thickness of the flooring on the low side. Bring the high side down so there will be less of a gap, at which point you can cut the jam when the flooring is being installed with an undercut saw. And then the other scenario is you're installing the door over some existing flooring. If that's the case, you may need to cut the frame down before you do the install. Figure out how off level you are and then cut it down accordingly. In my case here, this was an existing door that fit perfectly that I took out pretty much to make this video. So I'm just going to put back the shims that were already there, and then we'll move on to step number 3. So let's get to the fun part. We're going to start installing the door. Now this next part here is really where a lot of the magic in my method comes, and that is pre-installing the shims before you get the door in place. To do that, the best tool for this job is going to be a 6-foot level. You can get away with a 4-foot level. So I like to pre-mark my 6-foot level in the shim locations right below this top hinge, right above the middle hinge, and above the bottom hinge. Throw that on the jam, mark it out with a pencil where you're going to be putting the shims, and then just see what you're dealing with here. Now, even though this 2x4 framing is perfectly level, I'm still going to put shims in. There's a couple reasons for that. A lot of times this bottom plate here is going to be kicked out on the bottom because whoever cut it off didn't cut it off perfectly flush. And if you do not shim this, that is going to stick out the bottom of your frame and you're going to have troubles with that. The other thing is you'll see with the direction of the shims, putting the shims on here is always going to help the door close without binding. I would recommend getting like a proper cedar building shim, ripping it down to 1.5 or 1.75 inches. Now this is the key thing here. This is a left-hand swinging door that is going to close like this, open and close this way. You want, when I first started off, the way that my dad showed me is he would level the shims all like this, all the way down. What I found is it's better to just put the shims from one direction and keeping the fat part of the shim on the hinge side. That way you're not going to get any hinge bind. If you're dealing with a situation where you have to shim it out quite far, always have the hinge side shim more pronounced. Like you could go something like that. Always have more of this side so that your angle is going to be slightly closed this way. It's going to eliminate all the hinge binding problems. So to attach these shims, I like to use an 18 gauge nailer. You can use a crown stapler or even just like a little hand stapler works nicely too. 18 gauge nailer is nice if you ever have to take the shim off and adjust it. This is the way to go. So because we're level, we'll just put kind of the minimum amount of shim on there. If you're just putting on the minimal amount of shim when you're nailing it on with an 18 gauge nailer, just don't put a lot of pressure on there, otherwise you'll shoot right through. So get the top one on, get your level in place. This is where, and you want to check the level right at where the hinge is going to be sitting. So we'll come out right to the face here. That is pretty good right there. And then this is really where the beauty of the 6 foot level is you have a 4 foot level, you're kind of always going in between and hoping that it's all gonna line up perfect. With the big 6 foot level, you just put the shim in there, just till you snug it up. And then you're gonna get a perfectly straight line for the shims to sit in. So get that one on there. And we're ready to throw the door in. One quick little tip before we do, you need some type of a shim or some way to keep this door nice and level so it's going to make it easier to attach. One of these little pump up airbags is awesome because you can adjust it while the door is here. You can put your foot on and tweak it so that it's nice and flush up here. What I've used in the past is just taking some of the shims, taped together 3 or 4 of them, and then you can use that as well. It's going to make it way easier to get this top lined up. Just get that bottom sitting nice and flush. And then you want to just flush up this top part here. So we'll pump up the bag. That's pretty nice. What you can do as well is you can just throw a shim on this opposite side. This kind of holds everything snug so you're not struggling with it. Now when it comes to attaching the door frame to the studs, there's a couple of options. If you are a production carpenter, and what I highly recommend is a 15 gauge nail gun. The nails are nice and thick. They're going to offer a lot of holding power for the door frame, and it's super quick. Now, if you're just a homeowner or you're working with solid core doors, the best thing is going to be just a drill with some screws, and I recommend these headless screws. You're going to have a much nicer paint job with the headless screw. To secure the door, you want to go through the jamb, right through the shim and into the 2x4. When it comes to the depth here, you want to be just past the face of here. Don't go in too deep, otherwise it's going to compromise the strength. The next step here is to flush up the bottom of the door frame with the drywall. Once you get that sitting nice and flush, grab your level and give it a check on the frame to see how level plumb it is this way. That is looking good. If you're not quite plumb this way, but you're still flush with the wall, it means that your wall framing is a little bit off plumb. You want to just kind of split the difference so that you're closer to plumb on the jamb. And if you have a little bit of a lip on either side of the drywall, you can always hack that back to get your casing sitting nice. It's important to be as close to plumb as you can. That way your door is not going to want to swing open or close on its own. Of course, you don't want to cheat it too much because then your casing is going to be quite crooked. In this case here, we're nice and plumb, so I'm going to go ahead and attach the bottom. And then rather than put this screw in the middle here, you want to just close the door here and see how things are looking. So the door is closed. You can see in the top here, this side of the jamb needs to go up a little bit. So we'll adjust that up with a shim. There. So yeah, you kind of want to work your way around this way. This is nice and level across the top header here. And you can see the gap is a little off here, so we're actually going to throw a shim over here just to tweak that over a little bit. That is looking really nice. So the next step here is to attach this top of the door. This reveal is perfect. This is looking good. So we'll throw a screw in up there. If you're a little unsure of how that's sitting, take one of the shims and get that on there. That will help you get it lined up just perfectly. And again with the shims, you don't need to shim it from both ways. Keep the fat side on the inside of the door swing. Just double checking the gaps here. Everything's looking great. The next step is to come to the outside of the area here, and you want to flush this up with the drywall, but there's also, you have to check out how the door is sitting up against the strike part of the jamb. Yeah, this one is hitting perfectly flush all the way along this little strike part of the jamb. If it's not, there's a couple things you can do. Let's say it's not hitting on the bottom. There's a bit of a gap on the bottom. You can kick the bottom in over a little bit. And if you're not quite flush on the drywall, you can always hack a little bit of the drywall back, or you can always cheat it over on this side. If the door is not hitting on the bottom here, you can kick the bottom of this jamb. Even though that screws in there, you could still tap it with a block and a hammer, or just kick it with your boot and kick it over this way. That'll kind of flush it up on the bottom. In our case, it's hitting really nicely all the way along there. So now we come back to the inside and you go to the bottom corner here and you want to just eyeball the reveal. It's about 1/8 of an inch. So just eyeball it, get a shim in there. You're going to check it again. The gap is looking really nicely all the way along. Everywhere is looking good. At this point here, you can test the door. Take it to kind of the midpoint. It's not opening or closing on its own. That's a good thing. So then the last couple of steps here, you want to grab another shim, get the strike part of the door secure, eyeball the gap. That's looking good there. When it comes to the strike part here, I like to put the screws in through this part that the latch strike is going to cover. 2 screws in here because they'll make the door a little more secure, where it's going to take most of the force. That's beautiful. Then we'll circle back to this middle hinge here and pop a screw in there. Then the last thing that I'll do is check the gaps. It's hitting nice and solid. I'll take one more shim and throw it up on this top hinge. You don't want to push the door over. Snug it up. One last screw. And then when it comes to cutting off these door shims, the best tool for the job is going to be a multi-tool. You want to kind of rest it on the door frame and cut slight angle so that it's going to be not sticking out anywhere past the frame. If you don't have a multi-tool, you can always use a utility knife, but what you want to be careful of here is that you have a very sharp blade. You want to do a couple of scoring cuts, especially on the fat part of the shim, and really make sure that when you go to snap that shim off, you're not going to be tweaking the door, because that can really mess up your perfectly installed door. And hey, if you want to see my absolute best tip for casing out these doors, check out this video right over here. People are gonna kill me. I have to say plumb. I call everything level because I'm an idiot. Level, plumb, dumb. What?